Witnessing racism and injustice within his own company, a boss decides to disguise himself as a delivery driver to uncover the truth. What will happen when his true identity is revealed? This story will take you from one surprise to another, and the ending will make you reflect on the value of respect and fairness. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll send you another inspiring story, tailor-made for you. The story begins. The Chicago skyline shimmered in the fading light as Ethan Johnson's plane touched down on the runway, returning home after 6 months abroad. He was filled with pride for what his Urban Plate restaurant chain had achieved. Ethan had spent years building the business from a single food truck into a celebrated brand, lauded for its innovative cuisine and warm service. But the excitement of returning was tempered by a nagging unease. Reports of employee mistreatment had reached him during his travels in Europe, and these allegations couldn't be ignored. Ethan stepped into his penthouse apartment, his suitcase barely unpacked before he turned on his laptop to review the company's quarterly reports. Financially, the business was booming with several new locations opened in his absence. But beneath the glossy figures was a troubling employee turnover rate, particularly among kitchen staff, most of whom were Black or immigrants. His human resources director, Emily Carter, had flagged numerous complaints about a toxic work environment at several branches. The next morning, Ethan sat in his office, sifting through employee surveys and anonymous grievances. The language was damning. "I feel disrespected every day. Management doesn't care about us. They act like we're less than human." One comment stood out like a thorn. "I didn't sign up to be yelled at and called lazy because of my skin color." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His business was supposed to be a beacon of opportunity and respect. How had things gone so wrong? "Ethan, Emily, can you come in here for a moment?" Emily, "Of course, Ethan. What's up?" "Ethan, I've been reviewing these reports, and I'm deeply concerned about the allegations of discrimination and mistreatment. We need to get to the bottom of this." Emily, "I agree, Ethan. It's disheartening, especially after all the effort we've put into building a positive company culture." "Ethan, I have an idea. I'm going to go undercover as a delivery driver. That way, I can experience the work environment firsthand and see what's really happening." Emily, "That's a bold move, Ethan, but it could be very effective. I'll help you set up a cover identity and get you assigned to one of the branches with the most complaints." Ethan, "Thank you, Emily. I appreciate your support. This is something I have to do. I won't let these allegations go unchecked." A few days later, Ethan found himself standing outside an Urban Plate branch in a working-class neighborhood, wearing a delivery uniform and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He picked up a stack of orders and headed out, his heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and determination. His first few deliveries were uneventful, but then he encountered a group of employees in the kitchen who were openly making racist jokes and mocking a Black coworker. Ethan was taken aback by their blatant bigotry. He couldn't believe this was happening in his company. "Ethan, excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. I don't think that's appropriate." Employee 1, "Who are you to tell us what to do? Just get back to your deliveries." Employee 2, "Yeah, mind your own business, buddy." Ethan decided not to reveal his true identity yet. He wanted to gather more evidence before taking action. He continued his deliveries, listening and observing, and what he saw and heard was even worse than he imagined. Employees were being harassed, discriminated against, and even physically threatened. One evening, Ethan was delivering an order to a customer when he witnessed a manager berating a Black employee in front of everyone. The manager was yelling and cursing at the employee, calling him lazy and incompetent. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "Ethan, hey, that's enough. There's no need to treat him like that." "Manager, who are you to interfere? This is none of your concern." "Ethan, it is my concern when I see someone being mistreated. This is a customer service job, not a dictatorship." The manager scoffed and turned to Ethan. "Look, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but you better step aside before you regret it." "Ethan, I think it's time you know who I am. Ethan took off his baseball cap and looked the manager in the eye. "Ethan, I'm Ethan Johnson, the owner of this company." The manager's face turned pale. He stammered, "Mr. Johnson, I had no idea." "Ethan, that's obvious. What's also obvious is that you and several others have created a hostile and discriminatory work environment. That ends now." The news of Ethan's undercover investigation spread like wildfire through the company. Several managers were fired, and new policies were put in place to ensure fair treatment and respect for all employees. Ethan also launched diversity and inclusion training programs to educate his staff and promote a more inclusive workplace culture. The story of the boss who disguised himself as a delivery driver to expose racism and injustice went viral, earning Urban Plate even more accolades, this time not only for its food but also for its commitment to social responsibility. Ethan's actions showed everyone that true leadership means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Ethan called Emily into his office. The seasoned HR director placed a stack of documents on his desk, her face grim. "Darius, these complaints have been piling up for months," she said. "Most are coming from the kitchen and delivery teams. The senior staff at some locations, well, to put it mildly, they're not exactly embodying the values you've worked so hard to instill." Ethan sighed, running a hand over his face. "Why didn't I hear about this sooner?" Emily hesitated. "Frankly, some employees are too afraid to speak up. They don't think their voices matter, especially with how some managers have been dismissing them." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just about his company's reputation. It was about the people who had made his business thrive. The kitchen staff, the delivery drivers, the dishwashers. These were the people who kept Urban Plates running day in and day out, yet they were being treated as if they were invisible. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He replayed the complaints in his head, picturing the faces of those who had written them. He thought about his own journey growing up in Southside Chicago, working odd jobs to put himself through culinary school, enduring racist remarks and condescending attitudes from those who doubted his potential. It was those experiences that had driven him to create Urban Plates as a space where everyone, from the kitchen porter to the executive chef, would feel valued. But now it seemed his dream was being tarnished by the very discrimination he had fought so hard to overcome. As the sun rose, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't rely on reports or secondhand accounts. He needed to see the problem for himself, and the only way to do that was to go undercover. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at the Urban Plates branch in River North, one of the chain's busiest locations. Dressed in worn jeans, an old hoodie, and sneakers, he entered through the back door, where the kitchen staff came and went. He introduced himself as DJ, a new hire assigned to the dishwashing team. The assistant manager, a skinny man named Bob, barely glanced at him as he handed him a uniform and pointed him toward the dishwashing area. "Keep up with the plates and don't bother anyone," Bob said curtly before walking away. Ethan slipped into the lightly bleach-scented uniform and made his way to the dishwashing station. The work was grueling. Scraping food off plates, loading trays into the industrial washer, and stacking clean dishes for hours on end. But it wasn't the labor that occupied Ethan's mind, but the atmosphere. From his vantage point in the dishwashing area, Ethan observed the kitchen dynamics. The senior chefs, all white, barked orders at the line cooks and prep staff, many of whom were Black or Latino. The tone was sharp, the language dismissive. "Why can't you people ever get it right?" One chef snapped at a young Black cook, slamming a pan onto the counter. "Am I the only one who knows how to do anything around here?" Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on his task. He noticed how the Black employees avoided eye contact with the senior chefs, their shoulders slumping as they worked in silence. Meanwhile, the white staff joked and laughed amongst themselves, often shirking responsibilities onto their colleagues of color. When a delivery arrived during the dinner rush, Bob yelled for one of the dishwashers to unload the truck. Ethan volunteered, eager for a break from the steamy, cramped dish area. As he carried boxes into the kitchen, he overheard Bob mutter to another manager, "These people are so slow, no work ethic." Ethan felt his blood boil, but he kept his composure. He knew he couldn't blow his cover, not yet. That night, As Ethan walked home, his mind reeled with everything he had witnessed. The mistreatment, the casual racism, the utter disregard for the employee's dignity. It was even worse than he had imagined. He thought about the young cook who had been berated, the dishwasher who toiled away without a word of thanks, and the delivery driver who had been dismissed as lazy. These were the people who formed the backbone of urban plates, and they deserved so much better. Ethan knew he couldn't fix the problem overnight, but he also knew he couldn't remain silent. He needed a plan, one that would expose the toxic culture festering within his restaurants and hold those responsible accountable. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Ethan felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about saving his business. It was about honoring the values that had brought him this far, and he wouldn't rest until every employee, from the dish pit to the dining room, knew they were valued. The sun wasn't even up yet when Ethan Johnson arrived at the River North branch of Urban Plates for his second day undercover. The air was crisp and the streets were quiet, save for the rumble of delivery trucks making their early morning rounds. Ethan pulled his hoodie tighter around him as he approached the back door, blending in with the other early shift workers shuffling inside. "Yo, DJ," Bob, the assistant manager, barked as soon as he stepped through the door. "You're late." Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes before his shift officially started. He bit back a retort, remembering his role, and simply nodded curtly instead. "Won't happen again," he said, heading straight for the dishwashing area. The dishwashing station was already a disaster. Stacks of dirty dishes from the night before towered high, encrusted with hardened food. Ethan slipped on his gloves and apron, diving into the work without hesitation. The first hour passed in a blur of scraping, rinsing, and loading trays into the industrial washer. The humid heat and the smell of grease and detergent clung to his clothes. As Ethan worked, he listened. The clatter of pans and the sizzle of the grill echoed through the kitchen, punctuated by the sharp commands of the senior chefs. The head chef, a tall man named Greg, moved through the kitchen like a drill sergeant. His voice boomed across the room. "Pick it up, people, this ain't a social club," Greg yelled, slamming a ladle against the counter for emphasis. "If I have to tell you again, heads are gonna roll." Greg's gaze seemed to fall disproportionately on the Black and Latino staff. Ethan noticed how the white line cooks and prep staff were allowed to joke and chat as they worked, while their colleagues of color bore the brunt of Greg's criticism. "Johnson," Greg growled at one of the line cooks, a young black man who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "How many times do I have to tell you to keep your station clean? Do I need to hold your hand like a baby?" The line cook mumbled an apology, his shoulders slumping as he hurriedly wiped down his station. Ethan's grip tightened on the edge of the sink. He had been that young man once, trying to prove himself in kitchens where the color of his skin seemed to matter more than his skills. As the morning rush began, the pace in the kitchen intensified, orders pouring in and tensions rising. Bob, the assistant manager, darted around the prep area, his eyes peeled for any mistakes. He seemed to take particular delight in hovering over the dishwashing station. "Hey DJ," Bob called out, grinning, "you missed a spot on that plate. You gotta keep up, we're not running a charity here." Ethan forced a smile, masking his annoyance. "Got it," he said, scrubbing harder. He noticed how Bob's tone shifted when he spoke to the white staff, his demeanor suddenly polite, almost friendly. It was a subtle difference, but one that Ethan's keen observation didn't miss. During the lunch break, Ethan sat in the cramped employee break room, nursing a stale sandwich. He struck up a conversation with Emily, a Latina dishwasher who had been with the restaurant for 2 years. "It's not so bad," Emily said with a shrug when Ethan asked about her experience. "But you learn to keep your head down pretty quick. If you speak up, they just make your life harder." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Emily glanced around to make sure they were alone before leaning in. "A few months ago, I asked Bob why he kept giving me the closing shifts while others got to leave early. He told me I should be grateful to have a job." She sighed, a look of weariness on her face. "I stopped asking questions after that." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. It was the same story he had heard in the employee complaints. workers of color being overworked, undervalued, and silenced when they dared to speak up. By the end of his shift, Ethan was exhausted, his back aching from hours of standing and scrubbing. As he gathered his things to leave, he overheard Greg and Bob talking in a corner of the kitchen. "These dishwashers are useless," Greg muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "They don't care about quality, just here for a paycheck." Bob chuckled. "What do you expect? You know what those people are like." Ethan felt a surge of anger, but kept his expression neutral as he walked past them. Their words echoed in his mind as he made his way home, each syllable a reminder of the toxic culture festering within his restaurant. That night, Ethan reviewed his notes from the day. He listed each incident he had witnessed, from Greg's verbal abuse to Bob's condescending remarks. But more than the specific examples, it was the pattern that stood out. The subtle biases, the casual racism, the demeaning of the very people who kept the restaurant running. Ethan knew he couldn't confront the problem head-on just yet. He needed more evidence, more first-hand experience to fully grasp the scope of the issue. And so, he decided to continue his undercover mission, taking on a new role the following week. If working as a dishwasher had exposed the cracks in the system, Ethan suspected that being a delivery driver would reveal even more. It was time to see how his company treated those who represented it beyond the walls of the kitchen. As he prepared for the next phase of his plan, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work ahead would be challenging, but he owed it to his employees and to himself to face the truth and bring about the change his business so desperately needed. The first thing Ethan Johnson noticed about his new role as a delivery driver was the outdated truck he was assigned. It rattled and groaned as he pulled it out of the parking lot, the Urban Plates logo peeling and barely visible on the side. The vehicle seemed to be a metaphor for how little the company valued this part of its operation, a stark contrast to the polished, glamorous image the brand projected to its customers. For his cover, Ethan chose the night shift, knowing it would give him the opportunity to interact with both staff and customers, who often placed late-night orders. He donned a uniform that was clearly worn, blending in with the rest of the delivery team, many of whom were Black or immigrants. As he waited for his first order, he struck up a conversation with Jamal, a young Somali immigrant who had been working as a driver for over a year. Jamal sighed. "They treat us like we're invisible," Jamal said, leaning against the truck and taking a sip of his coffee. "The managers don't even know half of our names, and forget about asking for anything better. Better pay, better schedules, even just a working AC in these trucks." Ethan frowned. "Nobody's tried to push back?" Jamal gave a bitter laugh. "What's the point? Last time I asked for a shift change, the manager told me, if you don't like it, there's the door. So, I just keep my head down and do my job." Ethan nodded, the weight of Jamal's words settling on him. It was the same story he had heard from the kitchen staff, a culture of indifference and intimidation that left workers feeling powerless. His first delivery was a large order to an office building in the Loop. Ethan loaded the bags into the truck, double-checking the receipt before taking off. The drive was uneventful until he arrived at the building, where he was greeted by a security guard who barely glanced at him before pointing toward a back entrance. "That's for deliveries," the guard said curtly. Ethan lugged the bags through a dimly lit hallway, emerging into a bustling office space. The receptionist, a white woman in her late 20s, glanced at him and immediately turned back to her computer. He stood there for a moment, unsure if she had even registered his presence. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his tone polite but firm. "I have a delivery for Sterling and Company." The receptionist finally looked up, her expression slightly annoyed. "Just leave it on the counter," she said, gesturing dismissively. Ethan did as she said, resisting the urge to say anything further. As he left the building, he couldn't shake the feeling of being treated as an inconvenience, a ghost that people barely noticed. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way, but it still stung. Back at the restaurant, the atmosphere among the delivery drivers was tense. The night shift manager, a man named Mike, was berating one of the drivers, a middle-aged Black woman named Lisa, for a late delivery. "This is the third time this week, Lisa," Mike said, his voice dripping with condescension. If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be here. Lisa tried to explain that the truck she was assigned had broken down on the highway, but Mike cut her off. Excuses, excuses. Just do better. Ethan clenched his fists, his anger rising. He had seen the condition of Lisa's truck. It barely ran with a faulty ignition and an engine light that had been on for weeks. Yet Mike showed no concern for her safety or the challenges she faced. Instead, he treated her as if she were disposable. That night, Ethan sat in the break room with Jamal and Lisa, trying to understand their experiences. Lisa, who had been with Urban Plates for nearly 3 years, shared that she often felt invisible to management. They don't see us as people, she told them. We're just bodies filling a quota, and when something goes wrong, it's always our fault. Jamal nodded in agreement. It's even worse for the black and immigrant drivers. They treat the white drivers like gold, give them the best trucks, the easiest routes. But for us, we get the scraps. Ethan listened intently, his heart heavy with guilt and determination. These were the people who kept his business running, who represented his brand to the public. Yet they were met with disdain and disregard, their contributions undervalued and their dignity stripped away. His last delivery of the night took Ethan to an upscale neighborhood in the north side. The house was a sprawling estate with a manicured lawn and a gated entrance. As he rang the doorbell, he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, revealing a white man in his 40s, dressed in a tailored suit. He glanced at Ethan and frowned. "You took long enough," he said, snatching the bag from Ethan's hand. "Do you people know anything about prompt delivery?" Ethan bit his tongue, forcing a polite smile. "Sorry for the delay, sir. Enjoy your meal." The man muttered something under his breath and slammed the door shut. As Ethan walked back to the truck, he felt a familiar sting of disappointment, the same feeling he had gotten used to while growing up in Southside Chicago, dealing with people who treated him as less than because of his skin color. At the end of his shift, Ethan was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He returned the truck to the parking lot, thanking Jamal and Lisa for their camaraderie before heading home. As he stepped through the door of his apartment, the weight of what he had witnessed settled on him like a heavy cloak. The problems at Urban Plates weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic, rooted in a culture that valued profit over people and perpetuated racial biases at every level. Ethan knew he couldn't let this continue. His employees deserved better, and it was his responsibility to ensure they got it. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, compiling his observations from the past 2 weeks. He listed every incident, every remark, every injustice he had witnessed. He didn't know exactly how to address it all, but one thing was clear. It was time for reckoning. He decided to go undercover one last time, not to gather more evidence, but to connect directly with the workers who made his business thrive. He needed to hear their stories, understand their struggles, and show them that their voices mattered. As he closed his notebook and prepared for bed, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face the truth and fight for the change his employees deserved. Ethan Johnson arrived early at the Urban Plates location in Bronzeville, a historically black neighborhood in Chicago. This time he wasn't going undercover to observe, but to listen. For the past few weeks, he had worked as a dishwasher and a delivery driver, witnessing firsthand the toxic culture that plagued his restaurants. Now he wanted to hear directly from the employees, especially those most affected by the systemic inequities. Ethan's approach was simple. He told the manager, a middle-aged white man named Tom, that he wanted to shadow the kitchen and delivery staff to understand the operations. Tom, seemingly eager to impress, nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Mr. Johnson. Anything you need." What Tom didn't know was that Ethan planned to bypass the sanitized version of events that managers often curated for their superiors. He wanted the unvarnished truth, and he knew exactly where to find it. Among the workers who kept the place running despite the challenges they faced. Ethan started his day in the kitchen, where the line cooks were already busy prepping for the lunch rush. He struck up a conversation with Ashley, a black woman in her late 20s who had been with Urban Plates for nearly 2 years. Ashley was slicing vegetables with the precision of a seasoned chef, but her demeanor was guarded. "It's not a bad job," she said when Ethan asked about her experience, "but it's exhausting, not just physically but mentally too." Ethan nodded, encouraging her to elaborate. "It's like no matter how hard I work, it's never enough," Ashley said, her voice laced with frustration. "Chef Greg, he treats us like we're disposable. If you make one little mistake, he's on you. But the white cooks, they get second chances, third chances, all the chances." Ethan frowned. "Have you reported him?" Ashley gave a bitter laugh. "And risk losing my job? No thanks. I've got bills to pay." From there, Ethan moved on to the delivery team, where he met Miguel, a young Latino man who had recently started working at Urban Plates. Miguel was loading bags into his truck when Ethan approached, his face beaming with a friendly smile. First week on the job, Miguel said as Ethan introduced himself, trying to get the hang of things. "How's it going so far?" Ethan asked. Miguel hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It's okay, I guess, but I've noticed a few things. Like the other day, I asked for help with a big order, and the manager just shrugged, told me I should figure it out myself. But when one of the white drivers needed help, he jumped right in." Ethan's expression turned serious. It was the same pattern he had seen at the other locations. A disregard for black and immigrant workers, coupled with preferential treatment for their white colleagues. As the day wore on, Ethan noticed the subtle ways in which racial bias manifested itself in the workplace. A black prep cook was assigned the most menial tasks, while a white colleague stood idly by, chatting with the manager. A dishwasher was reprimanded for taking a 2-minute water break, even though white employees frequently disappeared for smoke breaks without consequence. Each incident, small and isolated on its own, painted a damning picture of systemic favoritism. Ethan also saw the resilience of his employees, how they supported each other, sharing jokes and words of encouragement despite the challenges they faced. He watched Ashley help Miguel navigate a particularly chaotic delivery schedule, her patience and kindness a stark contrast to the dismissive attitude of the managers. It was clear to Ethan that his employees weren't the problem. The problem was the culture that allowed such disparities to exist. During a lull in the afternoon, Ethan sat down with a group of employees in the break room. He framed the conversation as a casual check-in, but his questions were deliberate. "What's the hardest part about your job?" he asked. Ashley was the first to speak up. "It's the feeling like you don't matter," she said bluntly, "like you're just here to do the work nobody else wants to do." Miguel nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and when you do speak up, they act like you're the problem, like you're ungrateful." Another employee, David, a black dishwasher in his early 30s, chimed in. "It's not just about the work, it's how they talk to us, how they look at us like we're not worth their time." Ethan listened intently, his heart heavy with each story. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, one that he was determined to address. As the day drew to a close, Ethan thanked the employees for their honesty. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said, "and I want you to know that your voices matter. This company wouldn't exist without you." The employees exchanged skeptical glances, but nodded politely. They had heard promises from management before, and most of them doubted anything would change. But Ethan wasn't just a manager. He was the owner, and he planned to prove that he meant what he said. That evening, Ethan sat in his office, reviewing his notes from the day. He thought about Ashley's frustration, Miguel's hesitations, and David's quiet resignation. These were the people who poured their energy into his business only to be met with indifference and disrespect. Ethan knew it was time for action. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could take the first step towards creating the kind of workplace his employees deserved, and that meant holding those in power accountable. The next morning, Ethan called his HR director, Emily Carter, and scheduled an emergency meeting with the senior management team. He wouldn't tolerate any excuses or deflections. The toxic culture at Urban Plates had gone unchecked for too long, and it was time for reckoning. As he prepared for the meeting, Ethan felt a mix of anger and determination. His employees deserved better, and he was ready to fight for them, even if it meant making some difficult decisions. Ethan Johnson's decision to call an emergency meeting came after weeks of witnessing firsthand the toxic culture festering within his restaurants. But before confronting his management team, he wanted one final day undercover to solidify his understanding of the issues and catch anything he might have missed. He returned to the River North Branch, this time shadowing the prep team during the dinner rush. The kitchen was a hive of activity, the air thick with the smell of sizzling garlic and fresh herbs. The tension of the evening shift was palpable, and Ethan could tell that the pressure was higher than usual. Chef Greg was in a particularly foul mood, his booming voice echoing through the kitchen as he barked orders and berated the staff. "Johnson, what is this mess?" Greg roared at the young black line cook who had been a frequent target of his wrath. "Do you know how to plate a dish? Or are you just here to waste my time?" The line cook looked visibly flustered, hurriedly correcting his mistake, his hands shaking as he adjusted the garnish. "I'm sorry, chef, it won't happen again." "You're damn right it won't," Greg snapped back. "If I see another plate like that, you're out of here." Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. Greg's outbursts were harsh enough on their own, but it was the pattern that stood out. This level of disrespect was disproportionately directed at the Black and Latino staff, while the white employees rarely faced the same scrutiny. As the night wore on, Ethan's resolve to address the situation only grew stronger. The breaking point came when Greg publicly humiliated Ashley, the prep cook who had shared her frustrations with Ethan earlier in the week. Ashley had been working tirelessly to keep up with the demand, juggling multiple tasks with impressive efficiency. But when a late delivery of fresh produce disrupted her prep schedule, Greg saw an opportunity to unleash his anger. "This is unacceptable," he yelled, slamming a box of wilted spinach onto the counter. "Do you even care about this job, Ashley? Or are you just here to collect a paycheck?" Ashley's face flushed with embarrassment as the entire kitchen turned to watch. "I'm doing my best, chef," she said quietly. "Your best isn't good enough," Greg retorted. "If you can't handle this, maybe you should find a different job." The room fell silent, the weight of Greg's words hanging heavy in the air. Ethan could see the hurt and frustration in Ashley's eyes, and all he could do was maintain his composure. He wanted to intervene, to tell Greg exactly what he thought of his behavior, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Later that night, Ethan approached Ashley as she was cleaning her station. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ashley forced a smile. "Just part of the job," she said. "You get used to it." "Shouldn't be," Ethan replied. "Nobody should have to." Ashley sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It doesn't matter what I do. People like Greg will always see me as less than. I just keep my head down and try to survive." Ethan felt a surge of anger, not at Ashley, but at the system that had made her feel this way. He knew it was time for action. The next morning, Ethan called Emily Carter, his HR director, to finalize the details of the emergency meeting. "Make sure every senior manager and head chef is there," he said, "no exceptions." Emily hesitated. "Darius, this is going to cause a stir. Are you sure you're ready for the backlash?" "I don't care about the stir," Ethan replied. "I care about my employees, and I won't let this continue." As the meeting commenced that afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable. The senior managers and head chefs filed into the conference room, their expressions ranging from curious to apprehensive. Greg remained as arrogant as ever, taking a seat near the front, arms crossed over his chest. Ethan entered the room with a stack of papers in his hand, his face unreadable. He placed the stack on the table and took a moment to survey the room before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone even but firm. "As you know, I've spent the past few weeks working undercover at several of our locations. What I've seen and heard is deeply disturbing." The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Tom, the manager from Bronzeville, avoided Ethan's gaze. "I've witnessed disrespect, discrimination, and blatant racism," Ethan continued. "I've seen hardworking employees treated as if they're disposable. I've seen managers abuse their power and perpetuate a culture of fear and intimidation. And to be clear, this stops today." Ethan opened the stack of papers, revealing the employee complaints he had gathered over the past few weeks. "These are the voices of the people who keep this company running. They're tired, they're frustrated, and they deserve better." He turned his attention to Greg, fixing him with a stern look. "Greg, your behavior in the kitchen is nothing short of unacceptable. Publicly humiliating your staff, disproportionately targeting people of color, creating a hostile work environment. This isn't leadership, it's bullying, and it ends now." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan cut him off. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen it myself." Ethan proceeded to address each manager and head chef in the room, calling out their specific actions and highlighting the impact they had on their teams. By the time he finished, the atmosphere was thick with tension but also a sense of accountability. "This company was built on the idea that everyone deserves a seat at the table," Ethan said. "If you can't uphold that value, you don't have a place here." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing a series of reforms to address these issues. Diversity and inclusion training will be mandatory for all employees. A new reporting system will be established to ensure that employees can speak up without fear of retaliation, and any manager or head chef found to be perpetuating this toxic culture will face immediate consequences." Ethan scanned the room, his gaze unwavering. "You've been put on notice. It's time to decide what kind of leaders you want to be." As the meeting adjourned, the managers and head chefs filed out of the room, their faces a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. Ethan remained behind, staring out the window as he contemplated the road ahead. The work was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had taken the first step towards creating the kind of workplace his employees deserved, and he was determined to see it through no matter how long it took. The conference room was silent after the tense emergency meeting. Ethan Johnson stood at the head of the table, staring at the empty chairs where his senior managers and head chefs had sat just moments before. The weight of the confrontation still hung heavy in the air, but for Darius, the hard part was only just beginning. Speaking out against the toxic culture was one thing. Dismantling it was another. The following morning, Ethan met with Emily Carter, his HR director, to lay the groundwork for the changes he had announced. Emily, who had been with Urban Plates since its inception, was both supportive and pragmatic. "Darius," she began, flipping through her notes, "we can't fix this overnight. What you're asking for, rebuilding the culture from the ground up, is going to take time, resources, and, frankly, buy-in from the very people you just called out." "I understand that," Ethan said, his tone resolute, "but this is non-negotiable. I won't let my employees continue to suffer under these conditions. We need a plan, and we need it now." Together, they began to draft a comprehensive reform strategy. The first step was a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program for all employees, starting with the senior leadership. Ethan insisted on bringing in outside experts, particularly organizations with experience addressing systemic racism in the workplace. "This can't be a check-the-box exercise," he said. "It has to be real, and it has to challenge people to confront their biases." The next step was creating a safe, anonymous reporting system so that employees could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Emily suggested an external ombudsperson to oversee the process, ensuring objectivity. "We also need a way to measure progress," Emily added, "surveys, focus groups, something that lets us track whether these changes are actually making a difference." Ethan nodded, already envisioning the ripple effect of these initiatives. "What about accountability for leadership? How do we make sure the people at the top are actually living up to these values?" Emily paused thoughtfully. "We could tie it to performance. Reviews make equity and inclusion a metric they're evaluated on." "Excellent," Ethan said. "Let's do it." By the end of the day, the outline of the reform plan was complete. Ethan knew it was just the beginning, but it was a start, and that was enough to keep him motivated. The following week, the first diversity and inclusion training session took place at the company headquarters. Ethan decided to attend, not as an observer, but as a participant. He sat in a circle with his senior managers and head chefs, listening as the facilitator, a sharp and empathetic Black woman named Dr. Angela Barnes, began the session. "We're here today to talk about something uncomfortable but necessary," Dr. Barnes said. "Bias, prejudice, racism. These are words we often avoid in professional settings, but ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It's time to confront them head-on. Over the next 3 hours, the room was led through a series of exercises and discussions designed to challenge their assumptions and broaden their perspectives. Some participants, like Emily, engaged openly, sharing their experiences and insights. Others, like Greg, the head chef Ethan had confronted, remained defensive and dismissive. Look, Greg said during one discussion, I'm not a racist. I treat everyone the same. If someone's not doing their job, I'll call them out. It has nothing to do with their race. Dr. Barnes nodded, her expression calm but firm. Greg, is it possible that your expectations might be influenced by unconscious bias? That you might be holding some employees to a higher standard without even realizing it? Greg opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. For the first time, he seemed to consider the possibility that he wasn't as objective as he believed. For Darius, the session was both eye-opening and humbling. He realized he still had much to learn about the experiences of his employees and how systemic inequality had shaped their lives. But he also felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that these conversations were a crucial step towards creating meaningful change. The next phase of the plan involved implementing the safe reporting system. Posters were put up at every Urban Plates location, informing employees about the new hotline and encouraging them to speak up about any concerns. Ethan made it clear that retaliatory behavior against those who used the system would not be tolerated. In addition, Ethan began making unannounced visits to the various locations, talking to staff and observing the day-to-day operations. He wanted to ensure that the changes weren't just happening on paper but were being felt by the people who mattered most. At the River North Branch, Ethan was heartened to see small but significant improvements. Ashley, the prep cook who had been humiliated by Greg, was now leading her station with confidence. When he asked her how things were going, she smiled and said, "Better. People are actually listening." Jamal, the delivery driver, reported that his schedule had become more balanced and that the trucks were finally receiving regular maintenance. Not perfect, he admitted, but it's a start. Despite these positive developments, challenges remained. Some managers resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary or burdensome. Ethan addressed these attitudes head-on during a leadership meeting. If you think these reforms are optional, he said, his voice even but firm, then you're at the wrong company. Urban Plates was built on the idea that everyone deserves respect, whether they're a dishwasher or a head chef. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong here. By the end of the month, the effectiveness of the reform plan had become clear. Employees reported feeling more valued and heard, and customer satisfaction rates began to climb, a testament to the improved morale among the staff. But for Darius, the real victory was the sense of hope he saw in the eyes of his employees. They were no longer just surviving, they were starting to thrive. And though there was still much work to be done, he knew they were on the right track. As the reforms at Urban Plates gained momentum, Ethan Johnson began to see the cracks in the old system widening, and not everyone was happy about it. While many employees welcomed the changes, others resisted, particularly those in leadership positions who had grown accustomed to operating without accountability. One afternoon during a routine visit to the Bronzeville branch, Ethan walked in on a heated argument. Greg, the head chef whose behavior had been the focus of the initial complaints, was berating one of the prep cooks, a young Latina woman named Rosa. The exchange was a stark reminder of the toxic interactions Ethan had witnessed during his time undercover. "Why can't you ever keep up? This is basic stuff," Greg snapped, his voice echoing through the kitchen. "Do I have to do everything myself?" Maria's hands trembled as she tried to explain the delay, but Greg cut her off. "Spare me the excuses. I'm tired of hearing them." Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Greg, my office now." The kitchen fell silent as Greg followed Darius, his face a mixture of anger and apprehension. Once inside the office, Ethan closed the door and turned to face him. "Greg," Ethan began, his tone controlled but sharp, "we've talked about this. Your behavior is unacceptable. You're creating a hostile environment for your team, and it has to stop." Greg scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Look, I'm just trying to run a tight ship. If people can't handle the pressure, maybe they shouldn't be here." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locking with Greg's. This isn't about pressure. It's about respect. You've been given every opportunity to adjust your approach, but it's clear you're not willing to change. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending further review. Greg's mouth dropped open. You can't be serious? I'm dead serious, Ethan said. Clean out your locker. HR will be in touch with you later. Greg's suspension sent shockwaves throughout the company. For many employees, it was a sign that Ethan was serious about enforcing the reforms. For others, particularly those in similar leadership positions, it was a wake-up call. At a leadership meeting later that week, Ethan addressed the backlash head-on. I know some of you are having a hard time with these changes, he said, his tone even but firm, but let me be clear, this isn't a negotiation. Urban Plates will no longer tolerate disrespect, discrimination, or injustice. If you can't abide by these values, you're free to leave. The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of understanding in the faces of some of the more resistant managers. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and it was happening. Meanwhile, the positive impacts of the reforms were becoming increasingly clear. At the River North branch, Ashley had been promoted to sous chef, a recognition of her leadership abilities and culinary skills. The change in her demeanor was remarkable. Where she had once been hesitant and guarded, she now carried herself with confidence and pride. During a visit, Ethan pulled Ashley aside to congratulate her. You earned this, he said, shaking her hand. I'm proud of you. Ashley beamed, her eyes lighting up with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, that means a lot. The delivery team also saw significant improvements. The trucks were in better condition, the routes were more balanced, and the drivers reported fewer instances of mistreatment by management. Jamal, the Somali driver Ethan had befriended during his time undercover, told him it feels like people actually care now. I never thought I'd see the day. Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. This was the culture he had always envisioned for Urban Plates, a place where everyone felt valued, regardless of their position. While there was progress, Ethan knew there was still work to be done. The anonymous reporting system had uncovered new issues, including cases of wage theft and unfair scheduling practices. Ethan addressed these matters with the same resolve, ensuring that every complaint was thoroughly investigated and resolved. He also continued his unannounced visits to the various locations, talking to employees and observing their day-to-day experiences. These visits not only helped him stay connected with his staff, but also reinforced the message that he was committed to the changes he had implemented. One evening, Ethan attended a celebratory event at the Bronzeville branch to honor the employees who had gone above and beyond during the reform process. The atmosphere was festive, with music, laughter, and a sense of camaraderie that had been missing for too long. During the event, Ashley gave a heartfelt speech. When I first started working here, I didn't think my voice mattered, she said, but today I feel seen, heard, and respected. Thanks to the changes we've made together. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for believing in us. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. This was why he had fought so hard, for employees like Ashley, who deserved to feel valued and empowered. As the night drew to a close, Ethan stood outside the restaurant, reflecting on the journey so far. The road to change had been bumpy, but the progress was undeniable. His employees were starting to trust him, to believe that the company's values weren't just words on paper but principles they could count on. Ethan knew there was still much to be done, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Urban Plates was on its way to becoming the inclusive, respectful workplace he had always dreamed of, and he was ready to keep fighting for that vision, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Months after the reforms were put in place, Urban Plates was almost unrecognizable, not in its outward appearance but in the atmosphere that now permeated its restaurants. What was once a hotbed of hostility and bias was evolving into a workplace where respect, accountability, and opportunity reigned supreme. For Ethan Johnson, the journey had been anything but easy. He had faced resistance, setbacks, and moments of self-doubt. Yet, as he stepped into the River North branch for an unannounced visit, The warmth of the room affirmed that the struggle had been worth it. Ashley, now fully established in her role as sous chef, ran the kitchen with calm authority. The team moved efficiently, their communication seamless and respectful. When a new cook struggled to keep up during the lunch rush, Ashley intervened, not with reprimands, but with guidance. "Take a breath," she told the cook, her voice even. "Focus on one plate at a time. You've got this." The encouragement worked, and the young cook managed to catch up without further issues. Watching the scene unfold, Ethan felt a surge of pride. This was leadership, real leadership, and it was coming from within. In the delivery area, the mood was similarly transformed. The trucks were in good condition, the schedules were fair, and the drivers reported feeling more valued. Jamal, the Somali driver Ethan had befriended during his time undercover, approached Ethan with a wide grin. "Mr. Johnson, I hear you've been working undercover again," Jamal joked, extending his hand. Ethan chuckled, shaking his hand warmly. "Always keeping an eye on things," he replied. "How are things going?" Jamal's smile widened. "Better than I ever thought they could be. People are starting to believe that this company actually cares about them. And honestly, it feels good to be proud of where I work." Later that day, Ethan sat in a meeting with Emily Carter and the management team to review the progress of the reforms. The numbers spoke for themselves. Employee turnover was down, customer satisfaction was up, and the anonymous reporting system had seen a significant decrease in reported incidents of mistreatment. Emily, who had been instrumental in driving the changes, leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "You've done something incredible here, Darius," she said, "but more importantly, you've set a standard for what this company can be." Ethan nodded, his mind already buzzing with ideas for the future. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've proven that change is possible. Now we need to make sure it lasts." The culminating moment came at the quarterly employee appreciation event held at a local community center. Employees from all the Urban Plates locations gathered to celebrate their collective achievements, sharing stories of growth and camaraderie. The room buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the tense, divided atmosphere Ethan had encountered months prior. Ashley, now a rising star in the company, was asked to give a speech. Standing on the stage, she spoke with a confidence that would have been unimaginable before the reforms. "When I first started at Urban Plates, I didn't think my voice mattered," she said. "I thought I just had to keep my head down and take whatever came my way. But things have changed. Today I feel valued not just for what I do, but for who I am. That's the kind of culture we've built together, and I'm proud to be a part of it." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. This was what he had fought for, not just to fix the problems, but to create a space where people like Ashley could thrive. After the speeches, Ethan mingled with the crowd, sharing stories and laughter with the employees who had once been afraid to speak up. As the event drew to a close, he found himself standing next to Emily, watching the joyful scene unfold. "You've turned this company around," Emily said, her voice filled with admiration, "not just for the employees, but for yourself too." Ethan smiled, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Couldn't have done it alone," he said. "It's the people who make this place what it is. I just needed to give them the space to shine." That night, as Ethan walked through the quiet streets of Chicago, he reflected on the journey. It had been a battle not just against the toxic culture at Urban Plates, but against the systemic forces that had shaped it. Yet, in the faces of his employees, he saw proof that change was possible. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be perfect, but it was real and it was worth every step. As he looked up at the city skyline, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work wasn't finished, but for the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of hope. Urban Plates wasn't just a restaurant chain. It was a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the belief that everyone deserves a place at the table. And Ethan Johnson was ready to keep fighting for that vision, one day at a time. The story of Ethan Miller and his journey to transform American Grill reminds us of the power of kindness, empathy, and courage. Sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest acts. Here's the continuation and conclusion of the story. edited into English with the same care and attention to detail. Have you ever stood up for what's right, even when you knew it would be difficult? Do you believe that each of us can make a difference, however small? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can inspire so many others. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of respect and fairness. Thank you for your support. Let's work together to build a better society where everyone is valued. Wishing you joy and success. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive us with your understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.